talk about the missing and murdered women in British Columbia in terms of the laws and policies that have impacted First Nations women in Canada. And those laws and policies are mainly the Indian Act. So I'll tell it in the form of a story of how the laws impacted, first of all, my family. And then I'll talk about the missing and murdered women. So I'll just start off with just a historical sketch of the matrilineal societies that we came from. And most of the societies, First Nation societies in Canada, were matrilineal societies in nature. And what that means among the carrier is that when you're born into your mother's clan, and your mother, you follow that clan for the rest of your life until you die. And you don't you ever usually switch clans. You remember that clan throughout your life. And so that clan gives you a role in your society, in your family. Your father's clan is usually a different clan. And women have roles in those matrilineal societies. And those women, and the women in those societies usually have a very big say, at least among the carrier, have a very big voice within the family itself, and then within the community at large, and then also within the potlatch system. So families, communities, and then the overall potlatch system. Thanks. And they also have a place of honor and respect among those societies. So when the Department of Indian Affairs, the Indian Act, was introduced at the inception of Canada, what the law and policy was meant to do was to hit on those societies and break down those units. So what got introduced is a patrilineal system, much like the European system, where you follow your father's name. So there was somewhat of an adaptation among the communities. And for instance, like at home, you can see that the people didn't really understand how it worked. And so, like, for instance, my late father, his father's name was Pete Erickson. So our carrier people adapted it so that they would call my dad Louis Pete instead of Louis Erickson. And his brother, like his siblings, would use their father's first name for their last name. So it was kind of like, you can see them working at trying to adapt to a new system that they don't really understand. And so what happened with the new system that was introduced is that women were, there was legal Indians in Canada, and what legal Indians means is that you are a member, you are a status Indian according to the laws of Canada, and they decide what the rules are. And again, I have to say that they're patrilineal in nature. So what has started happening with women is that women were taken off the roles of being a status Indian when they were married. And so if they married a non-status Indian, and my father became a non-status Indian because his mother married a Swedish man. So when she married, she lost her status. And she worked, so they weren't allowed to live on reserve. And so my father lost his status as well. And so my mother was, when she married my non-status father, she lost her status. And all the women that, they were automatically taken off the list of being an Indian. And maybe that doesn't sound so bad, but one of the things that I learned in my role as I was appointed as a special representative in the protection of First Nations women's rights in 1999 by Robert Nault. And he was the then Minister of Indian Affairs and Northern Development, and one of the things that I found out, and I'd already known it, but that whole idea of the women no longer being status Indians was policed. And it was policed by the RCMP, by the priest, and by the chiefs and councils. So all men, really. And women weren't allowed to visit on the reserves after 9 o'clock, or they would be removed by the RCMP. And they were also removed with their children. And one of the stories that sticks out in my mind, when I was a special representative, I met a woman, and she said she remembered a story. She remembered a part of her life. I think we like to tell them as stories because then we can pretend that it's not our lives, it's somebody else's lives. But she said when she was 8 years old, her oldest sister had married a non-status Indian man in Alberta. And when she moved out to Alberta, and she was really homesick. She was really, really homesick, and she used to write letters home all the time. And she had 3 children, and it took her that long, having 3 children and everything else, to save up money for a trade trip to spend 3 weeks in Ontario with her mom and dad. And it would be the first time that her mom and dad saw the grandchildren. So she came out to Ontario by train. She came home, and the grandparents were just simply overjoyed. And the 8-year-old sister was overjoyed too to meet her nieces and nephew. And about 3 or 4 days after they arrived, everybody was in bed sleeping at about around 11. You know, the long summer nights, still light out, and there was a knock on the door, and the RCMP had arrived. And so the mom got up, and she said, well, you know, like, what do you want? And they said, well, is your daughter here? And she said, oh yeah, she's visiting from Alberta. And the RCMP said, well, does she have her kids with her? And she said, yeah, my grandchildren came out. It's the first time I met them. And they said, well, she's non-status Indian, and she can't be staying on the reserve. And they were like, well, no, she's not staying on the reserve. She's just visiting for 3 weeks, and then she's going home to Alberta. And they said, no, we're sorry. We have. By this time, her husband had got up, and they said, well, no, like, she has nowhere to go. And the 8-year-old girl said she, to this day, didn't know where the police took her sister and her 3 nieces and nephew that night. And she said she remembers laying in bed too scared to get up to ask her parents if their sister was in jail with her kids, or if her sister had been taken to the train station, which would be closed until the next evening to catch the train back to Alberta. And so those are some of the stories that women had to endure, that kind of dispossession and disenfranchisement from their communities. One of the stories, well, there's actually 2 stories of my home reserve, Nakasley Indian Reserve, of the women whose marriages had fallen apart in the 50s, and they came home, and in the one case is my aunt. Her dad was the chief, and she was staying with her dad with her 5 kids from an extremely abusive marriage, and she had nowhere to go, so she had gone home to the reserve. And her dad, after about 3 weeks, finally said, Mary, I really don't know what to do. He said, I'm the chief of this reserve, but everybody keeps phoning me, and the Indian agent keeps phoning me because people have reported on the reserve that you're living in my house and you're a non-status Indian now because you married a non-status Indian and your kids are non-status. And he goes, so you can't stay here anymore, but I can help you find a house or somewhere to live until you get resettled. And one of my late mom's friends also talked of the same story of her friend having left an abusive marriage, and her dad was also the chief, and same thing, that she was wanting to stay at home in her birth parents' home, and people just complained so miserably until her dad, the chief, had to ask her to also just go but return to the abusive marriage because she was not allowed on the Indian Reserve after 9 o'clock. I find this really hard to talk about. I don't think I've sort of gone through this whole story in public before because I don't think that a lot of people know, and I don't think that people realize how devastating the Indian Act was, especially to women. So it wasn't until the Corbière-Laval cases in, the 1970s, where even if your marriage broke down, you weren't allowed back onto the reserve and you weren't allowed to regain your Indian status. So the cases, was actually the Lovelace case that went to the United Nations in, I think it was about 1970. The court said, the first case that went to the Canadian court was determined that First Nations women, or Indian women then, weren't discriminated against because they were all discriminated against equally. So that, I know, it'd take a judge to, take a man to figure that one out. So it wasn't until the United Nations when Linda Lovelace went to the United Nations, and she was heard there, and they didn't actually make a decision, but it was then that Canada was pushed to change their policies regarding Native women in Canada. So what ended up being introduced was, later on in 1985, was Bill C-31. And Bill C-31 was introduced to reinstate women that had lost their status through marriage and other means. And so part of my story was that I had regained my status, because as you remember earlier I was saying that my mom lost her status, so there's 9 of us siblings, and I was the first one to regain my status through marriage. So, and that's why I'm a Notley member band, because you automatically were put onto your husband's band. So again, promoting that patrilineal model. And so when my husband, my then husband we had had our 2 older children, and then we got married. And I automatically assumed that both of my kids would become status Indian because he was status Indian, because I was automatically becoming a status Indian. And the Department of Indian Affairs wrote to us, and I wish I would have kept the letter. I didn't keep the letter, but what they told my husband and I is that we had to adopt our own 2 children. And like, I've always been known for being crazy, but I'm not that crazy. And I just absolutely could not do that. I just absolutely couldn't bring myself to adopt my own 2 children. And my husband's 2 children, like, he signed both of the birth certificates. And my sister-in-law of the day, my former husband's sister, her and her husband had gone through the same thing. And actually, I don't even know why they made them adopt their own daughter, because she and her husband were both status Indian. But because they weren't married, they made them adopt their own birth daughter so that she could be a status Indian. So you have really a bizarre set of rules of law that were in effect really until Bill C-31, when it was brought to light that the women in Canada, Aboriginal women in Canada, were suffering from this kind of discrimination. So the Bill C-31 was introduced, and that was to start getting women to come back. Well, the problem with coming back is you have many reserves now that have really totally adopted a patrilineal system, and the type of policing that I'm talking about through the Indian agents, the RCMP and the chiefs, really has had its effect on people, and especially in the Alberta areas, are the really rich bands who really don't want to accept women back. So a couple of strange things, stranger things, I don't know if anything could get stranger than what's already happened, but the women are not accepted back by their member bands. So, but they're accepted back as legal Indians by the registry in Ottawa, right? So the women are band members, but the bands don't want to accept the women back onto the reserves to build houses and become a part of that, their band and their community, right? So it's been a really long haul for a lot of women, I think, and there are a lot of horror stories of what happened to the women during those years. I guess one of the stories as special representative also that I remembered was a woman from Alberta, and she had 11 children, and she said her husband was extremely abusive, and she used to be able to put up a good fight because she was strong, and she was still feisty when she was 70. And she said she was pretty tough, so she could hold her own most of the time with her husband, but the marriage was so abusive, and she wasn't allowed to go back to her home community, and her husband was non-status. And she said so she always ended up going back because she didn't have anywhere else to go to her husband but to her husband. And she said finally in later years she would be on the highway in Alberta hitchhiking down the road with anywhere from 5 to 11 children. And right when the snow started to fly, she said it always seemed like it was right when the snow started to fly that she just couldn't take the abuse anymore. And she'd head out, and she said she usually stayed in the Kootenays somewhere with her kids, and then when spring came, the kids finished school, she'd usually end up back in the relationship. But she said that was the cycle of her life, of just having no one or no one to go to and nowhere to go. And she said she couldn't go home because everybody would just say, well, you can't stay because you're like not an Indian, and so you're not allowed to stay on the reserve. And she had tried to get help from the band for her and her kids, but she was always told that, well, you can't get any help here, you have to go somewhere else. So that's the sort of the policy that the law and policy that was in effect in Canada. And more recently you have Sharon McIver, who's gone back to the court because there's still the double mother clause, where if your mother and grandmother were status, you can't get your status, your children can't get their status. But if your father, like your fathers always tend to have status, so those kids, the brothers can get status for their kids, but the sisters can't get status for their kids. So there's still residue discrimination left, and that's why Sharon McIver has gone to the Supreme Court. But I guess just recently the Supreme Court of Canada has decided that they won't hear her case. She had won it at the trial level, and it was appealed by the Government of Canada. And what the appeal court did was the appeal court made a really narrow scope of how many people can return. And so Sharon wanted the trial division's interpretation of who could return because it was much broader and much more sweeping. So more women and more children could become status Indians again. But when Canada appealed it, it went back to a really narrow scope of who can return. So the Supreme Court of Canada has decided that they won't hear. She wasn't granted leave to the Supreme Court. So we'll see in the coming days what happens, but since 1985, the membership has really remained in limbo with regard to like on the face of it, on paper, women have been allowed back. And we were one of the lucky families that our band actually, our birth band, Nakazi Band, approached us to our family to come back and be part of their band. And I think one of the things about BC bands, I haven't done an empirical study, but I'm hunching, like our group in Carrier Country, we have a potlatch system. And I talked about that system earlier, matrilineal system, that we still have, like the potlatches. I'm a member of the Frog Clan. So that kept us as part of the community in some way, in a bigger way, I think, than, say, bands that don't have a potlatch system. So we were active members of our community. And as soon as Bill C-31 was introduced, our band approached us and said, well, you guys have to apply to our band because you're really members of our band and we want you back. And that's one of the few happy stories to tell about Bill C-31, because a lot of women have gone back and they're just accepted back on paper, but the residency is still a problem. So the two big issues that arise from it are residency and membership. So it's actually a piece of land to build a house on and to have that home stability. So that is the historical piece. And I guess one of the things that I was lucky enough when I was growing up, my late mother, Sally Erickson, she was a member of the BC Native Women's Society. She was one of the founding members. And she always fought for Aboriginal rights and women's rights. And a lot of the work that I did as a special representative, and then I went on to work for the Native Women's Association of Canada as well. And a lot of women remembered my mom. So it really helped to have that background. And still being from a matrilineal society, we still had the matrilineal system in place. And in some ways, I was lucky because I didn't have to go to residential school. So I grew up with some really strong women and some really strong role models during my mom's time. And they were still really, the women were still really self-sufficient because they had their crafting. They did sewing. They did sort of like a co-op for sales. And so they had a real international group of buyers that used to be tourists, and they would come in the summer times, and my mom and all of her friends would have moccasins, purses, vests, you name it, they would have it all ready for the summer, and people from all over the world would come to our doorstep, and the women would always have a phone list, and like they'd know who had purses, who had this, who had that. And so they were still really self-sufficient that way, and they always had their sewing machines. And so I grew up with this really, actually it turned out to be a really utopian idea of Aboriginal women. Like I thought that all Aboriginal women were self-sufficient and that all Aboriginal women had their own money and they were good to go, really, you know? And then I went to university, and I remember my mom was still alive in my first year of university, and I told her about, I took a feminist course, and I found out about European women and how European women were they were in the Victorian era, and when they came to Canada, they were considered pieces of property, and they couldn't vote, and the men decided everything, and we couldn't stop laughing. And she goes, well, who's raising their sons? She goes, I don't get it. So we sort of been full circle, but it was really funny. Like we just couldn't believe any of it, right? So that was, yeah. So it was really good in that sense that my mom and her friends, and like all of them, their first languages were still carriers. So to some degree, you still see the strength in that society and that culture. So then the next part of my talk is about how the Highway of Tears is my job. I work as a lawyer, Amy said earlier, And so I've always taken a great interest in women's roles. And I had actually gone to Harvard Law School after the 1992 Charlottetown Accord, when Aboriginal women weren't going to be afforded the sexual equality provision under the Constitution. And I felt really offended by that, because I thought that the reason that the sexual equality provision was in the Constitution to begin with was because of Aboriginal women. I think that Euro-Canadian women came without those kind of protections. And I think that Aboriginal women were role models for sexual equality at the beginning of Canada, because you see the women's groups that took root in North America. I think Aboriginal women provided good role modeling for them, and the women's rights took off like no other place in the rest of the world. So that's my theory, and I'm sticking to it. So I thought that for Aboriginal women not to be provided the sexual equality provision under the Constitution in 1992 was just nothing but a slap in the face. And that was being negotiated by our men's organizations at the national level, that somehow women were going to, they said that we have our own sexual equality at home and we'll enforce it. And I thought, yeah, right. They have, you know, the Department of Indian Affairs idea of what sexual equality is, right? Not our own traditional ways. And we had huge debates at the law school about how that provision would be implemented. And it's like, well, if you're a lawyer and a woman comes to you because she suffered from sexual inequality and she looks Indian as a lawyer, do you ask her, well, you can't use this section, or do you wait and take the case anyways and take her money because you're a lawyer and you need to make money, right? So, and wait for the judge to kick her out, or like how would they have enforced that? So 1992, that was my push to continue on in law, and I looked at women and how Aboriginal women and our traditional ways, and started sorting that piece out, which took me to many places in the work that I've done. And lately that work is with the Carrier Secondary Family Services, and I'm called the Highway of Tears Coordinator. And what's happened in the north is that in 2006, Nicole Hoare went missing. Nicole Hoare is a 25-year-old woman from Red Deer, Alberta, and she was a tree planter. And when she went to, she was hitchhiking to her house in Smithers, and when she went missing, it became national and then international news that she had gone missing. And then it was brought to light that there was 9 other women that went missing. And those women were Aboriginal women, 8 women I should say, so 9 in total, including Nicole. And they were all Aboriginal girls. They really aren't women, they're like 14, 15, 16, so it's not, when you hear about the missing women on the Highway of Tears, they're not women at all, they're girls. And so that brought the light upon the whole notion of missing and murdered women in the north. In 2007, the RCMP added 9 more women to that list. And when they added those 9 other women, that set the date of the first missing woman to 1969, so 40 years of missing and murdered women. And when I took the job, I noticed that because that hadn't been brought out in the media. And I just assumed that the women that were added were in the same time era, right? So we sat down when I took my job and I said, you know, I really think that we have to start asking for an inquiry. Right now, the United Nations has asked Canada, 2 of the United Nations committees, the Human Rights Council and the Committee to End Discrimination Against Women, has asked Canada what is going on with the missing and murdered Aboriginal women in Canada. The Native Women's Association of Canada has put the number of missing and murdered women at 520 across Canada. So nationally, 520 missing and murdered Aboriginal women. BC is the leader in the provinces. We have 137 missing and murdered women in the province of British Columbia. Alberta is behind us with 84 missing and murdered Aboriginal women. And then in the larger provinces like Quebec, there's 18 missing and murdered women. There's 2 missing and murdered women in Newfoundland, Aboriginal women. So by far, BC has a big problem, and it's been silenced. There's been a conspiracy of silence around it. And one of the things that really irks me about the missing murdered women is that the RCMP categorized them, and so does the media, that they were engaged in high-risk behavior. And high-risk behavior means to the RCMP that, number one, they were hitchhiking, or number two, they were into drugs, or number three, they were, I don't know, doing something else. I can't remember what the third category was. But the women are put out into the media as high risk. And I've looked at what's been out in the media, I've talked to the families, and there's really not a lot of evidence that any of the girls were really hitchhiking at all. Mona Wilson went missing and she was walking to school. Monica Ignis went missing, she was walking to school. And you have to walk on the highway to get to school. Gloria Moody, the woman that went missing in 1969 in Williams Lake, was last seen getting into a car. So the RCMP has been automatically categorizing them as high risk, so that what happens, I think, in the media, and this is why I want an inquiry, because again, it's just my theory, but I think that a lot of the women are, I think society can somehow justify that, well, if they were into bad behavior or high risk behavior, that they were somehow consenting to going missing or disappearing. Which brings me to my final part in this speech. I've been given my 5-minute notice, but one of the things that's happened 2 weeks ago today, there was a call for a salmon inquiry, a Pacific salmon inquiry into missing and disappearing sockeye salmon. And I just was so offended, like I was so upset about that. My 14-year-old daughter came home from school and she had heard about it, I guess, on the radio that morning. She knew all about it. She says, Mom, so if I could transform myself into a salmon and disappear, I could get an inquiry about what happened to me. And I said, yeah. She goes, yeah, that's pretty weird, Mom. And I said, yeah. And then my daughter, she's in a master's program. She was in Vancouver at a conference. She phoned me after work that day too, and she said, Mom, they're having a sockeye salmon inquiry. And I was like, I know. And she goes, well, I have this idea. I think that you should write to Justice Cohen. He's the judge that's being appointed for the salmon inquiry, and he's been given broad and sweeping powers for the inquiry. She said, I think you should write to Justice Cohen and tell him that you can tell him what happened to the fish. And she said, and I'll get a picture off the internet. We'll send him a picture of a fishing trawler. And then you can tell him that he can give you the money to conduct an inquiry into the missing murdered women, and we've solved their problems with this salmon, with regard to the salmon. So it was hard because at home we have a crazy kind of a joke. When we're having fun, we'll say, oh, I love you more than a million sockeye. So maybe it's really not a joke anymore. It's like, it's just so misguided, this call for the salmon inquiry. And I guess one Vancouver reporter that I was speaking to on the phone and talking about my just disgust with the whole thing was, he said, well, I guess one bad sockeye salmon season will do it, right? And yet we have 40 years of missing and murdered women, and really horrific stories of displacement, disenfranchisement, dispossession. And some of the stories are that, you know, women never did make it home. And I remember growing up, and my one aunt, she married a non-native fellow, and she always used to say, the only way I can come home is in a pine box. And I never really got the full meaning of that until I started my studies and then realized that, yeah, that's the only way you get to come home was in a pine box, because you were never welcomed home unless the women, like the Corbière Laval women, the Lovelace women, had not had, you know, the strength to take those cases forward. I don't even know where they got the money, like, you know, to go to the courts and become reinstated. So I would like to thank you for that. And then I have a couple of announcements that Tracy wanted me to make, and that is that there's a luncheon in, I can't remember the room, Tracy. Minero D room for any women that just want to have lunch with me and Aboriginal women regarding missing and murdered women. And then also Tracy had the opportunity to fill out this NWAC, Native Women's Association, who've been a real, those are the numbers I use, are the Native Women's Association of Canada's numbers. And they've been a real steady and slow and steady advocate for the missing and murdered Aboriginal women. So they've developed a form that Tracy printed off a bunch of copies, and what they're trying to do is build a database of missing and murdered women. Because like on the Highway of Tears, there are 18, and those are the RCMP's 18, right? But in Portage, that's a community near mine, a woman's been missing for 8 years. I've talked to women on the highway between Prince Rupert and Prince George, and they've named at least 3 other women that aren't on the list. So there's a lot of women, like Jill Stichenko was just found murdered in Prince George 2 or 3 weeks ago. She's First Nation from the Kitimat area, but the RCMP say, well, she's not on the list, you know. So we're sort of at the whim of, you know, what the RCMP are going to tell us, like the big daddies. So it's a long and winding road. So, and then I've asked if, and I don't even have the Attorney General's address handy, but like if there's anything that you could do is just write to the Attorney General a letter, is short and simple, and ask him for inquiry into the missing and murdered women in BC. And I really think it's urgent in BC because we have the most missing and murdered women. So in terms of, I think that's it for announcements then, Tracy. So there's a form that's available. Tracy has made copies that are available out in the foyer. So once again, I'd like to thank you for coming out, and I really enjoy coming to this conference. Tracy's invited me a few times, so thank you once again for having me.